In this episode, we're going to step back from individual controls and talk about the invisible forces that decide whether a privacy program is coherent or chaotic, the requirements that tell you what you must do, what you should do, and what you must never do. New learners often assume privacy is mostly a set of best practices you pick from, but real privacy programs are shaped by obligations that come from many directions at once. Some requirements are external, like laws, regulators, and contracts with partners, while others are internal, like company policies, risk appetite, product promises, and operational realities. When you can identify these requirements early, you stop treating privacy as guesswork and start treating it as a disciplined decision process with defensible trade-offs. That skill matters on the exam because it explains why the same technical control might be sufficient in one situation and insufficient in another, depending on what rules and commitments apply. A strong privacy program begins with an honest understanding that requirements are not just a checklist, but a set of constraints that shape design choices before you ever talk about specific tools or configurations. If a rule requires data to be retained for a certain time, that influences storage and deletion decisions. If a rule requires user choice for certain tracking activities, that influences how you implement consent tagging and cookie controls. If a contract prohibits sharing data with subprocessors without approval, that influences which vendors you can use and how data flows are designed. Beginners sometimes want a single universal rule, but privacy requirements vary by jurisdiction, by industry, by data type, and by business model. The practical goal is to identify what requirements apply to your organization's data and systems, and to translate them into clear internal expectations that engineers and operators can follow consistently. When requirements are not identified early, teams build systems that later must be retrofitted, and retrofits are where privacy programs lose time, money, and credibility. External requirements often feel intimidating because they include laws and regulations that sound technical, legal, and sometimes contradictory, but you can approach them with a consistent set of questions. Ask what types of personal information are in scope, what activities are regulated, and what rights or protections must be provided to individuals. A major source of external requirements is privacy law, which can include frameworks like General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, and California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, but the important skill is not memorizing every rule in every jurisdiction. The skill is identifying which jurisdictions apply based on where the organization operates, where its users are, and where data is processed or stored. External requirements also come from regulators and enforcement bodies, which can issue guidance, interpretations, and expectations that shape how rules are applied in practice. Beginners should understand that compliance is not only about the words on a page, but also about what enforcement looks like and what regulators commonly expect in evidence and documentation. When you identify external requirements accurately, you can build controls that match the real expectations rather than an imagined version of them. Industry and sector requirements are another external force that shapes privacy decisions, especially in highly regulated fields like healthcare, finance, education, and government contracting. These requirements can include sector-specific privacy rules, breach notification obligations, and constraints on sharing and secondary use that are stricter than general privacy laws. Even when a law does not explicitly mention a specific technology, sector expectations often become practical requirements through audits, contractual obligations, and industry norms. Beginners should recognize that external requirements can also include standards and frameworks, which may be voluntary in theory, but effectively mandatory when customers demand them. For example, a security standard may not be a privacy law, but if it shapes how you protect access to data and how you log and respond to incidents, it directly influences privacy outcomes. The privacy program must therefore recognize that confidentiality and integrity expectations from security and safety standards can become privacy obligations when personal information is involved. When sector requirements are identified early, you avoid designing a program that fits one context while silently failing another. This is how you keep the privacy program consistent across business units and product lines. Contracts are often the most immediate and enforceable external requirements because they define what you promise to customers, partners, and vendors, and those promises can be stricter than baseline legal rules. Data processing agreements, vendor terms, customer enterprise contracts, and partner integrations often contain requirements about permitted uses, subprocessing, breach notification timing, audit rights, retention, and deletion. Beginners should understand that contracts translate privacy from theory into specific obligations with deadlines, evidence expectations, and financial consequences. Contracts also define roles and responsibilities in data handling relationships, such as whether you are acting as a controller or processor in certain contexts, and that role affects what decisions you can make independently. Another key contract-related idea is data transfer restrictions, including cross-border transfers and onward sharing rules, which can shape architecture choices and vendor selection. When privacy engineers ignore contracts, they risk building workflows that violate agreements even if the workflows seem reasonable internally. When contracts are tracked and translated into operational requirements, teams can design systems that meet obligations without constant emergency escalations. A contract-aware program is a program that can scale partnerships without losing control of data. Internal requirements are just as important because they determine what the organization commits to doing beyond what the law explicitly requires, and those internal commitments often shape trust and brand reputation. Internal requirements include corporate policies, privacy principles, risk appetite decisions, and product design commitments that define what the organization considers acceptable. For example, an organization may decide that it will not use certain categories of data for marketing, even if it might be legally permissible, because that aligns with its values and customer expectations. Another internal requirement is operational feasibility, meaning what the organization can consistently execute given its staffing, tooling, and maturity. Beginners sometimes assume internal requirements are optional, but internal commitments become real obligations the moment they are communicated to users or embedded into contracts and public promises. Internal requirements also include governance expectations, like who must approve new data uses, how changes are reviewed, and what evidence must be maintained for audits. When internal requirements are clearly defined, teams can build with confidence and reduce friction because decisions do not change randomly based on who is in the room. Internal requirements are the glue that turns external rules into consistent internal behavior. A privacy program also needs to identify requirements that come from the business model and product functionality, because the way a product creates value influences what data it needs and what privacy risks are inherent. A fraud prevention service, for example, may require certain behavioral signals to detect abuse, while a content service may rely on some personalization to remain useful. The privacy challenge is that business needs can be used to justify overcollection unless the program defines clear boundaries around necessity and proportionality. Beginners should learn to treat business requirements as inputs that must be translated into minimal, purpose-bound data processing decisions, rather than as unlimited claims. Another part of business requirements is the customer experience promise, such as whether the product is designed for privacy-conscious users or whether it operates in contexts where people have heightened sensitivity to tracking. These expectations influence what tracking technologies are acceptable, what default settings should be, and what level of transparency is required to maintain trust. When the privacy program understands business requirements clearly, it can propose privacy-respecting designs that still preserve product value. This is how privacy becomes a design partner rather than an after-the-fact constraint. Requirements also come from data itself, because different categories of data carry different risks and often trigger different obligations. Sensitive personal information, children's data, precise location, health-related records, and biometric identifiers often demand stricter handling, stricter access control, and clearer justification for processing. Beginners should understand that classification is not an academic exercise, because classification determines which requirements apply and how strict they are. The same storage platform might be acceptable for low-sensitivity data, but unacceptable for highly sensitive data if it cannot enforce the needed access controls, logging, and retention behaviors. Data category also influences breach impact and breach notification obligations, because the harms associated with exposure can vary dramatically. Requirements derived from data classification also affect how you design analytics and AI pipelines, because the risk of inference and re-identification increases when data is rich, unique, and persistent. When data categories are identified and tied to requirements, teams can avoid the common mistake of applying one uniform control level to everything. Uniform controls feel simple, but they often underprotect high-risk data and overburden low-risk workflows, creating incentives for bypass. Once you recognize that requirements come from many sources, the next step is to build a practical way to capture them so they can actually guide decisions. In many organizations, this takes the form of a requirements register, which is a maintained record of obligations, their sources, and what they mean for the organization's data and systems. Beginners should understand that the value of a register is not the document itself, but the consistency it creates. It turns scattered knowledge into a shared reference that teams can use when designing new features. A requirement becomes useful when it is translated into control expectations, like retention windows, consent conditions, access restrictions, logging requirements, and vendor review steps. It also becomes useful when it is mapped to data assets and systems, so you know where the requirement applies in practice. Another part of operationalizing requirements is defining ownership, meaning someone is accountable for keeping requirements current, interpreting changes, and ensuring the program responds. When requirements are captured and owned, privacy decisions become repeatable and defensible rather than personal and subjective. Mapping requirements to the data lifecycle is where privacy engineering becomes concrete, because each stage of the lifecycle is influenced by different obligations. Collection is shaped by notice and consent requirements, as well as minimization expectations. Use and analytics are shaped by purpose limitation, disclosure rules, and constraints on automated decision-making in some contexts. Storage and retention are shaped by record-keeping obligations, data minimization principles, and contractual commitments to delete or de-identify data after certain events. Disclosure and transfer are shaped by contract terms, cross-border considerations, and vendor obligations, as well as by internal rules about what sharing is acceptable. Destruction is shaped by deletion rights, retention exceptions like legal holds, and the need for verifiable outcomes across systems, including backups and archives. Beginners should practice seeing these links so requirements do not feel like separate legal facts, but like lifecycle constraints that must be engineered into systems. When you map requirements to lifecycle points, you can quickly identify where controls must be built, where evidence must be generated, and where the biggest risks of noncompliance and trust failure exist. This mapping is what prevents a privacy program from focusing on one stage while neglecting another. Requirements also need change management because privacy obligations evolve, business models change, and technology shifts can create new exposure paths. A privacy program cannot treat requirements as static because new laws can be introduced, regulators can issue new interpretations, and vendors can change their terms. Internally, products evolve, new features introduce new data collection, and new analytics ambitions can create new purpose questions. Beginners should understand that requirement change management is not only about reading legal updates, but about building a reliable process that detects changes and evaluates impact on data flows and controls. This includes a disciplined approach to assessing whether new requirements require new consent language, new retention behavior, new vendor restrictions, or new evidence practices. It also includes avoiding overreaction, because not every change requires rebuilding everything, but every change should be evaluated. A mature program establishes triggers for review, such as adding a new data category, deploying a model that uses new features, or integrating a new third party. When change management exists, requirements remain a guiding force rather than a surprise. A common beginner misunderstanding is that requirements are only constraints, but in practice they are also decision tools that protect teams from making risky choices under pressure. When a product team wants to launch quickly and suggests collecting extra data just in case, a clear minimization requirement provides a principled way to say no and to propose alternatives. When an engineering team wants to add a third-party tracking tool for convenience, clear tracking governance requirements provide criteria to evaluate whether it is acceptable and what controls must be in place. When an analytics team wants to repurpose data for a new model, purpose limitation requirements and consent tagging requirements provide a structured way to assess whether the use aligns with what was promised. Requirements also support escalation pathways, because when trade-offs are hard, teams can bring the decision to the right owners with a clear description of which obligations are at stake. Beginners should see that this reduces conflict because decisions feel less personal and more principled. Another misunderstanding is treating requirements as purely legal, when many important requirements are operational and ethical commitments that shape trust. When teams use requirements as decision tools, privacy becomes less about fear and more about consistent engineering judgment. Evidence and documentation are part of requirements identification because many privacy obligations are not satisfied by good intentions, but by being able to demonstrate that controls exist and work. This is why requirements should be translated into artifacts and signals that can be produced reliably, such as records of consent state, records of disclosures, logs of access, proof of retention enforcement, and proof of deletion completion. Beginners should understand that evidence is not just for auditors. It is also for incident response and for internal confidence, because without evidence, teams cannot know whether the program is functioning. Evidence should be proportionate and purpose-driven so that it does not create new privacy risk, such as collecting excessive logs that include sensitive content. It should also be tied to ownership, because evidence that is not maintained becomes outdated quickly and loses value. Another important point is that evidence expectations influence technical design, such as whether systems can generate audit trails and whether data inventories are maintained. When you identify requirements, you should identify the evidence needed to satisfy them, because that is what makes the program defensible. A privacy program that cannot demonstrate its claims is a program that will struggle under scrutiny. As we conclude, the key lesson is that privacy program decisions are shaped by requirements from the outside and the inside, and your job is to identify them early, translate them into actionable controls, and keep them current as the environment changes. External requirements include laws, regulators, sector expectations, and contracts, all of which can impose specific obligations on consent, disclosure, retention, transfer, and deletion. Internal requirements include policies, risk appetite, business model constraints, product promises, and operational realities that define what the organization commits to beyond baseline legal rules. Data categories and sensitivity levels create additional requirements because different kinds of data demand different handling, and those requirements must be reflected in architecture and control choices. A practical program captures requirements in a maintained register, maps them to data assets and lifecycle stages, and builds change management so new features and new rules trigger review before risk spreads. Requirements become powerful when they serve as decision tools, reducing ad hoc choices and enabling consistent trade-offs that protect trust. When you can explain how to identify, translate, and operationalize requirements as the foundation of every privacy decision, you are demonstrating a core task one capability: building a program that is not only well-intentioned, but consistently aligned with the obligations and promises that define privacy in real systems.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.